The afternoon sun was really hot, shining down hard on the police car as Officer Ethan Carter drove through the small, twisty streets of a neighborhood that looked old and worn out. Inside the car, the air conditioning was on, making it cool and comfortable. Dan looked carefully at the broken houses and messy yards outside, always watching to see if there was trouble. His partner, Officer Harper Lewis, sat next to him and took a sip from her water bottle. "It's quiet out here today," she said. Her voice was calm, but a little worried. Dan nodded, still looking at the road. "Too quiet. Quiet makes you wonder what's really going on." They didn't say anything else for a while, both thinking the same thing. Suddenly, the radio in their car made a crackling noise, breaking the silence. "All units near Oakwood. We got a 911 call." A young boy called for help, and then the line went dead. "The location is near 1542 Sycamore Street. Be careful." Dan and Harper Lewis looked at each other quickly. "That's close," Harper Lewis said, already checking the GPS on the dashboard. "Just a few blocks away." Dan grabbed the radio. "This is Unit 247. We're heading to 1542 Sycamore. ETA is 3 minutes." He turned on the sirens and pressed harder on the gas. The car zoomed through the quiet streets. As they got closer, the houses looked worse and the streets were messy. They passed old, rusty cars, tall grass, and trash everywhere. Harper Lewis rested her hand on her holstered gun. "This doesn't feel right," she said softly. Dan's face was serious. "Yeah, something's wrong. Stay alert." When they got to 1542 Sycamore, Dan's stomach felt tight. The house looked like it hadn't been taken care of for years. The paint was peeling off, showing the rotting wood underneath. The porch sagged, and the steps looked ready to break. The yard was filled with old junk, including an old fridge lying on its side with the door open like a creepy mouth. "This place is a mess," Harper Lewis muttered as she got out of the car, looking around carefully. Dan nodded, eyes open. This could be anything. They walked up to the front door slowly, their hands near their guns. Harper Lewis knocked hard on the door. "Police. Is anyone inside?" It was quiet, too quiet. Dan leaned in, trying to hear something, but nothing happened. Harper Lewis knocked again, louder this time. "This is the police. If anyone's there, come to the door." Still nothing. The air felt heavy, like something bad was about to happen. "Let's check the door," Dan said. He tried the doorknob, but it didn't move. "Locked," he said, glancing at Harper Lewis. She gave him a small nod. Dan grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. No answer at the door. Requesting permission to enter." The radio crackled back. "Permission granted. Be careful." Dan took a deep breath. With Harper Lewis watching his back, he pushed hard on the door, but it didn't open. "Too strong," he said. "Let's check the backyard." They walked around the house, brushing past tall, wild bushes that grabbed at their uniforms. The backyard was just as messy as the front. Weeds grew everywhere, and old junk was scattered all over. As Dan walked, his foot caught on something hidden in the grass, and he stumbled. Harper Lewis quickly reached out to steady him. "You okay?" she asked. Dan crouched down, brushing away the weeds. His heart sank. It was an old, rusty tricycle. Nearby, there were more toys, a broken dump truck, a faded baseball, and a stuffed animal that was falling apart. "Kids used to live here," Harper Lewis said softly, kneeling beside him. Dan stared at the toys, a bad feeling growing in his chest. "Yeah," he whispered. "What happened to them?" Harper Lewis looked at the toys carefully. "These haven't been here long. Someone was here recently." Dan shivered, even though it was hot outside. "Something's not right. We need to get inside." Back at the front of the house, Dan grabbed his radio again. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. We found signs of kids being here recently, but there's no answer. Requesting backup." The reply came quickly. "Backup is on the way. ETA is 5 minutes." As they waited, neighbors started peeking out of their windows. Some even came onto their porches, watching closely. Their faces didn't look friendly. "They don't seem happy to see us," Harper Lewis said quietly. Dan nodded. The neighborhood had a bad reputation for not liking the police. He hoped they wouldn't cause trouble. Soon, 2 more police cars arrived. Officer Hale, an experienced cop, got out. His face was serious. "What do we have?" he asked. Dan explained the situation quickly. That call sounded really bad. If there's a kid in trouble, we need to hurry. Hale nodded. Let's do this by the book. Hernandez and Garcia, cover the back. Harper Lewis, you're with me. Dan, take the lead. The officers got into position. Dan's heart raced as he got ready to go inside. On three, Hale said, 1, 2, 3. Hale kicked the door hard, and it broke open with a loud crash. A horrible smell hit them immediately. It was so bad that Dan almost threw up. He covered his mouth and stepped inside. Police, he called out. If anyone's here, come out. No one answered. Dan shone his flashlight around. The kitchen was disgusting. Moldy food and trash were everywhere. The sink was full of dirty dishes, and flies buzzed all around. The fridge door was open, and it smelled awful. Clear, Dan called out, holding his sleeve over his nose. Clear here too, but you need to see this, Harper Lewis called from the living room. Dan walked into the next room. It was just as bad. The furniture was old and ripped. Empty bottles were scattered everywhere, and the coffee table had drug stuff on it. Heavy meth use, Harper Lewis said, pointing to the syringes and baggies. Dan's face was grim. This is bad. Let's check upstairs. They carefully climbed the creaky stairs, checking every room. Each one was messy and filled with signs of neglect. But there was no sign of the boy who had called. At the top of the stairs, Dan and Harper Lewis met up again. This isn't making sense, Dan said, frustrated. Could the call have come from somewhere else? Harper Lewis asked. Dan frowned. Maybe. Let's search one more time. As they started back down the stairs, a faint sound made them freeze. It was hard to hear over the flies and creaking house, but it sounded like a child's voice. I'm here. Help me, the voice cried weakly. Dan's heart pounded. He looked at Harper Lewis, and they both knew what to do. Guns drawn, they ran back upstairs. Police, where are you? Dan called out. There was silence. Then the small voice spoke again. Here, please help. The sound came from the end of the hall. Dan and Harper Lewis moved quickly, but carefully. At the end of the hall, they found a small door. It was locked. Step back, Dan said. He kicked the door open. Inside, his flashlight lit up the room, and what he saw made his stomach drop. In the corner, chained to a radiator, was a little boy. He was wearing torn blue shorts, and his body was covered in bruises and sores. He looked so thin and weak, like he hadn't eaten in a long time. The boy's head hung down, and his eyes barely opened to look at them. Dan's breath caught. The boy looked familiar. Too familiar. Then it hit him. This was his son, Alan, whom he hadn't seen in 2 years since the bitter divorce. Dad, the boy whispered, his voice dry and cracked. Dan dropped to his knees. I'm here, buddy. I've got you. You're safe now. As Harper Lewis called for an ambulance, Dan worked to free Alan from the chains. The boy's wrists were raw and bleeding from the metal cutting into his skin. Dan found a water bottle nearby and gently helped Alan take small sips. Easy, buddy, Dan said softly. Help is coming. When the paramedics arrived, they carefully lifted Alan onto a stretcher. As they worked, Dan noticed something under the radiator. It was an old flip phone. Harper Lewis, he called, holding it up. I think this is how he called for help. Harper Lewis looked at the phone and shook her head sadly. That poor kid. He must have been so scared. Dan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He was so close to giving up, but he still found the strength to call for help. Harper Lewis put a hand on his shoulder. He's a fighter, Dan. Just like his dad. Dan watched as the ambulance drove away, carrying his son to safety. He slipped the old phone into an evidence bag, vowing to find out who had done this to his boy. It wasn't just a clue. It was proof that Leo had fought so hard to stay alive, even though terrible things had happened to him. Dan was so sad, but also very proud of his son's Br. Harper Lewis. Leo didn't give up. He found a way to reach for help until someone came. Dan climbed into the ambulance, his heart heavy from what his son had been through. But deep down, he promised himself to find out the truth and make things right. The house was busy with lots of police officers. Dan stayed close to Leo, speaking gently as paramedics checked him. His blood pressure is very low, one paramedic said with a serious face. He's very dehydrated and hasn't eaten enough. We need to get him to the hospital fast. Another paramedic, a younger man, looked at Leo's arms and legs carefully. He might have hurt his joints from stretching too far. We'll need to be careful and get trauma doctors ready, he said. Dan nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. I'm going with him, he said firmly. He wasn't going to leave his son alone. As they carried Leo out on a stretcher, Dan saw a crowd outside. People were watching because of the flashing police lights and loud sirens. Some people were yelling mean things at the police, but an officer touched Dan's shoulder and said, "Don't worry about them. Focus on your son. Take Harper Lewis with you." Dan helped lift Leo's stretcher into the ambulance. Leo felt so light, and it made Dan's heart ache. Outside, the crowd whispered when they saw how thin and weak Leo looked. Dan blocked their view with his body, protecting his son from their stares. He climbed into the ambulance and held Leo's hand as the paramedics worked quickly. The ambulance raced to the hospital, its sirens screaming through the city. Dan's heart was breaking. How long has he been like this, he thought. Why didn't I try harder to see him after the divorce? Guilt filled him. Dad, Leo whispered weakly, pulling Dan out of his thoughts. Dan squeezed Leo's hand gently. I'm here, buddy. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Leo's tired eyes looked up at his dad. You came. I knew you'd come, he said softly. Tears filled Dan's eyes. Always, he said. I'm so sorry it took this long, but I'm here now. I'll never let you go again. Rest now. You're safe. When they got to the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed to take care of Leo. They hooked him up to machines to give him fluids and medicine. A nurse told Dan to wait while they worked on his son. We'll let you know when you can see him, she said kindly. Dan sat in the waiting room, his head in his hands. His partner, Harper Lewis, came and sat beside him. How's Leo? She asked softly. Dan shook his head. They're working on him. He looks so small and hurt. How did this happen? Harper Lewis put her hand on his shoulder. We'll figure it out, she said. Right now, just focus on Leo. Have you called Lila Bennett? Dan blinked, realizing he hadn't thought about his ex-wife. He had so much to do, but Leo was his first priority. Finally, a doctor came out. Family of Leo Carter, he called. Dan jumped up. I'm his dad. How is he? The doctor's face was serious, but not hopeless. Your son is stable, but in critical condition. He's very malnourished and dehydrated. He also has untreated fractures and joint damage. We're moving him to the pediatric ICU. He'll need a lot of care, but with time and treatment, we're hopeful he can recover. Dan felt his knees wobble, but Harper Lewis helped steady him. When can I see him? He asked. Soon, the doctor said. We need to do some more tests first. Dan waited, feeling like time had slowed down. When a nurse finally came to get him, he rushed to Leo's side. Seeing his son so small in the big hospital bed, hooked up to machines, made his heart hurt even more. Leo opened his eyes and smiled weakly. Dad, he whispered. Dan leaned close. I'm here, buddy. You're going to be okay. Leo's voice was faint. I tried to be brave. Dan's voice cracked as he said, You were brave, Leo. Braver than anyone should have to be. I'm so proud of you. Just then, a doctor came in to explain more tests they needed to do. Leo looked scared. Can my dad come with me? He asked. Dan squeezed his hand. Of course, buddy. I'll stay right by your side. As they wheeled Leo to the test room, Dan stayed close, whispering encouragement. After the tests, the doctor explained that Leo's arms and shoulders had been hurt because he stretched too far, likely to reach for something. Leo softly said, I was trying to get the phone. Dan's heart broke at the thought of his son, trying so hard to call for help. Later, Dan got a text from another officer, Hale. We arrested 2 people at the house, it said. One claims to be Leo's mom. Call me. Dan left Leo with Harper Lewis and called Hale. What happened? He asked. Hale's voice was angry. We found Lila Bennett and her boyfriend. The house was full of drugs. They're addicts, Dan. It's awful. Dan felt a wave of anger. Did they say anything about Leo? The boyfriend admitted some things. Hale said, You need to come to the station. At the station, Dan saw Lila Bennett in a cell. She looked thin and sick, not like the woman he used to know. Her boyfriend sneered at Dan. Come to feel like a hero, the man said mockingly. Dan gripped the bars tightly. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. How could you do this to my son? The man leaned against the wall with a nasty smile. Oh, "So you're the dad?" he said slowly, his words sounding mean. "Yeah, I locked the kid up. He was always whining, always getting in the way. We didn't want him around." He shrugged like it was no big deal. "Had to shut him up somehow." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, and his voice shook as he yelled, "How long? How long did you keep him locked in that room?" The man didn't answer. He laughed a bitter, mean laugh. "What? You think I'd call the cops and let you come play hero? With all the stuff we had in the house? You must be dumber than you look." Ethan gripped the bars of the jail cell, his whole body shaking with anger. His voice was low and dangerous. "You nearly killed him. He's only 8 years old. 6 when I left. He's just a kid." The man leaned forward, his mean smile turning into something worse. "You want to know how it started? Don't you? How your perfect little family fell apart." Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't back away. He stared right into the man's cold eyes. The man chuckled, enjoying himself. "It all started one night at the bar. Your wife was there, looking all sad. She told me she left some drunk cop who crashed his car. Guess that was you, huh?" Ethan felt his chest tighten as the man's words hit him. His grip on the bars got tighter, but he didn't say anything. The man's grin grew bigger. "That night, I gave her something to make her feel better. Meth. After one try, she couldn't stop. She wanted more of the drug. And more of me." He laughed in a dark, mean way. "She's been with me ever since. Guess she decided I was better than a boring cop and a whiny kid." Ethan growled, his anger boiling over. "You ruined her. You took her away from her son." The man shrugged like he didn't care. "I didn't force her to do anything. She made her choices. Maybe if you'd been a better husband or father, she wouldn't have left. But you weren't, were you? So don't act like you're better than me. You have your booze. I have my drugs. We're the same." That was too much for Ethan. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's shirt through the bars. Strong arms pulled him back. It was Harper Lewis, his partner. "Ethan, stop," she said sharply. "This won't help anyone, especially your son." The man's laugh echoed through the room, loud and mean. "That's right, go run back to the kid you abandoned. Let's see how long you can keep it together this time." Ethan shook Harper Lewis off and walked away, his whole body trembling with guilt and anger. The man's words hurt, reopening old wounds he'd tried to ignore. "Ethan," Harper Lewis said softly, "don't let him get to you. Remember who needs you right now. Think of Leo." Hearing his son's name calmed Ethan a little. He took a deep breath and turned away from the man's mocking laughter. He had to focus on his son. By the time they got back to the police station, Ethan had calmed down, but the weight of everything still hung over him. "I'm sorry," he told Harper Lewis. "I lost control. I needed to understand, but I don't think I ever will." Harper Lewis nodded. "Some things aren't meant to be understood, Ethan. What matters now is what you do next. Leo needs you to be strong." Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a message from the hospital. "Leo's asking for you. Is everything okay at the station?" For the first time in days, a small smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "I have to go," he told Harper Lewis. "I need to be with my son." Every step out of the station, every mile he drove toward the hospital, made him feel stronger. He was going to be there for Leo, no matter how hard it was. The hospital was quiet as Ethan walked to Leo's room. The sound of beeping monitors and soft footsteps filled the air. He paused outside the door, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Leo's face lit up when he saw his dad. "Dad," he said, his voice small but clear. "You came back." Ethan's heart ached at the mix of hope and sadness in Leo's words. "Of course I did, buddy," he said, sitting by the bed. "I promised, didn't I? And I keep my promises." The nurse smiled. "Told you your dad wouldn't be gone long," she said before leaving them alone. Leo's voice was soft. "I missed you, Dad. I didn't think you'd remember me." Tears stung Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them away. He gently held Leo's hand. "I never forgot you. Not for a second. I missed you every single day." Leo's lips quivered. "But Mom said, she said you didn't want me anymore." Ethan's heart broke. "Oh, buddy, that's not true. Not at all. I wanted to be with you more than anything. But your mom and I, we fought a lot. She thought it was better for you if I stayed away. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I should have tried harder. I'm so sorry." Leo nodded, his grip on Ethan's hand tightening. "What happens now?" he asked. Where will I go? Ethan's voice was firm. You're coming home with me. We'll find a new place. Just for us. We'll build a life together. Leo's eyes lit up. You really want me to live with you? More than anything in the world, Ethan said. It won't be easy, but we'll get through it together. Leo smiled a little. Okay, he whispered. Ethan leaned back, stroking Leo's hair as the boy drifted off to sleep. Rest now, buddy. I'll be right here when you wake up. As the first rays of sunlight peeked through the window, Ethan promised himself he'd make things right. He and Leo would rebuild their lives, one day at a time, with love and hope lighting the way. This story shows how hard life can be for kids like Leo, who live in homes where they're not safe. Many children go through similar things, or even worse, and they need someone to help them. If you ever notice a child who seems scared, sad, or hurt, tell an adult you trust. If you're a parent or someone who looks after kids, always remember to show them love and keep them safe. Kids need to know they're cared for no matter what. What do you think about this story? What can we do to help kids like Leo? Let's talk about it and figure out how we can all make a difference. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more content like it, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest, inspiring and heartwarming stories and have the opportunity to engage with our growing community. Additionally, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comment section below. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to sharing more captivating narratives with you.